Okay, so here I am once again with the Crypto Fatcat. Jonathan, where are we at? What the hell is going on with the latest chapter of the crypto crumbling?
Um, well, all hell has sort of slowly stopped breaking loose. I'm happy to say it feels like the crypto markets have found a bottom, at least a local bottom, where they've been bouncing back up over the last few days a little bit, which is great instead of just a continue erosion in price and value, which it seemed like a possibility. It may still happen for sure. But it's nice to see any kind of support, which it does seem like Ethereum's hit a support number around like 1150 or so. Bitcoin's hit a support number around 16,000. And they don't seem like they last very long below that before they seem to pop back up, at least so far. There may be more bad news, which may continue to drive things down. BlockFi just officially filed for bankruptcy yesterday, I believe, which isn't good if you had money in BlockFi, which I know at least one person who did. I'm sorry to say for them. It's a shit show. It's probably going to continue to be a shit show for quite a while.
And so my understanding is the BlockFi bankruptcy was kind of expected because of their close ties to FTX. What about something else, something like a Gemini, for example? What are you hearing about that?
Funny you should ask. So Gemini has the normal Gemini exchange, and they have a separate lending piece called Gemini Earn. And Gemini Earn is something they actually subcontract out to a company called Genesis. And I actually have had a fair amount of money in Gemini Earn at different points. I saw that as very safe, a very safe return. It was much less than some of the kinds of returns we've talked about in previous episodes, getting like 20% on your money or 18% on your money. It's nothing like that. It's at its best, I think it was like 7.5%. Lately, it was like 5.9%, which is still better than you can do, at your local Chase Bank. But in the crypto world, it's very conservative type returns. And they were doing institutional lending, and it seemingly was very safe. And I had actually put a big chunk of money back in there maybe about 2 months ago as the Luna thing we seemed to have moved on from it. And so when the FTX bankruptcy was announced on Tuesday, I believe it was either 2 or 3 weeks ago, probably 3 weeks ago today as we're recording this, I did start to wonder if maybe I should pull that out. But I let myself just think about it a little bit. And 2 days later, a crypto analyst friend of mine actually wrote to me and said, you should not be in anything like this. Like, you should get out. So I did. So I redeemed my Gemini, which takes 5 business days, up to 5 business days. Usually it's almost instantaneous, but the next day was Veterans Day. I wasn't surprised that it might take a while because I assumed a lot of people were probably redeeming their Gemini Earn. As long as the money was there, it didn't really matter, right? Then on the following Wednesday, so 3 business days later, Gemini sent out an email saying like, hey, like when you get those texts, like, hey, so all you Gemini Earn people, the company that runs that is not actually us. Haha, that's Genesis and they're going bankrupt. Yeah. So we're pausing withdrawals and we're doing our best, to get the money out and pay everyone off. But, we're pausing withdrawals. And generally, when someone pauses withdrawals, they never get unpaused, like pretty much always, unless it's sort of a short-term. Sometimes there's a short-term reason why an exchange or someone will pause withdrawals. But sort of for any kind of like, we just don't have the money kind of reason, almost never gets resolved. Like, who wants to come in and buy that and bail someone out in that spot? There's almost never a good reason to do that. Almost never. So I luckily did get my money out 6 hours before they sent that "you're fucked" email. I got my redemption email from Gemini and actually did get my money by some miracle. I beat the clock and got out just in time, but I know a lot of people didn't. And it's not that they'll never see any of that money, but it might take years and years and they'll probably see much less of it. And that's sort of the best case scenario. Like 25% 6 years from now is like the best case scenario. I guess the best case scenario is someone comes in and buys out Genesis and gives them all, and the money comes back. One of the things that happens here, so Genesis didn't actually, wasn't necessarily playing fast and loose with client funds, but they were doing longer term duration investments that they couldn't get out of quickly. So when there was a bank run, they were just screwed. They didn't have the liquidity to help people get out. And so they had to declare bankruptcy instead. And that's pretty rough. And something you said to me before we started recording was how the parallels between what happens in crypto these days, at least with the centralized exchanges and decentralized companies, and the global financial crisis and just other big banks and big banking kind of stuff, investment houses, that all the financial shenanigans that's happened over the last 30, 40, 50 years that we've seen. And there's a lot of similarities there. And I think there continue to be, and it's not surprising to me. These are ultimately just financial instruments being manipulated by financial guys. Now, true, pure crypto is a different thing. That's no centralization at all, right? That's not using exchanges. That's a different deal. And we can talk about the good and the bad with that. There's certainly pros and cons there. But the kind of stuff that's happening with FTX, with BlockFi, with Gemini Earn, this is all centralized stuff that really crypto was built to avoid. But mostly people don't choose to avoid it because it's a little more technical, at least still, to figure that out, you know? We're not all the way there yet technologically, where it's the graphic user interfaces are easy enough for my grandma to just be like, yes, I will self-custody this Bitcoin and it will be no problem. We're definitely not there.
So when you were telling me, 6 months ago, a year ago, about these accounts where you could take your funds and you could place them into an account that's going to give you 8%, 12%, 20%, or sometimes more.
Yeah.
At the time, I just couldn't understand it. I remember sharing with you, like, I don't get it. How back then, when you could, we're getting less than 1% at the bank, how can these people be giving you these huge returns? It's just natural that if there's returns that big, that there's a high level of risk with it. And I remember at the time you were talking about, well, there isn't a high level of risk with it because of what were the reasons that you believe there were not a high level of risk with it then?
Well, most of the things I was referring to was not centralized. It was decentralized stuff. And so it was essentially a marketing cost is what the returns were. Like that was the PR. So that's like the advertising cost for the program or the blockchain or whatever it might be. That was the application that was doing it. So I used one example back then of something I think called Kava, which I was getting like 23% at the time. And now you can't do that well, but you can still get, even right now, like 18% on cash on Kava. And but the thing is, what they're giving you is they're giving you their token, which they printed up and has value right now. And you can spend it, you can turn it into dollars right away. It's liquid. So you can immediately flip it for dollars if you don't believe in their token. And if you do, you can hold it and hope it goes up or be part of that ecosystem. That's up to you. But that's the way the decentralized players do it more of the time anyway, is they're not leveraged in all these weird ways. It's just that Kava has all these Kava tokens that they printed up that are specifically earmarked to being returns for people who contribute to the ecosystem. And so you just get a slice of that. And so right now that's a pretty good slice because there aren't so many people contributing. As more and more people contribute, those returns will continue to come down and probably eventually find a more normal profit instead of super normal profit. As opposed to what happens in centralized stuff, where these big places are lending with each other and they're doing it without true collateralization. So something you have talked about in previous episodes, just before we even started this one, was how FTX and Alameda were doing all this borrowing against their FTT. And they're saying like, hey, well, come on, we got $2 billion of FTT here. Of course you can lend us $100 million. There's nothing to be concerned about. Like, what's the worst that can happen? And they borrowed a lot of money from a lot of places using some form of that argument. And the problem is that when you have $2 billion worth of FTT, let's even say it was unlocked, which it wasn't all. So you couldn't even get to some of it. But to whatever amount, when you've got that much, you actually don't have that much. Meaning, like, if you have $10 billion of FTT, you can't actually sell it for $10 billion. There aren't $10 billion worth of people trying to buy it. That's too much. You will crash the price if you try and sell it. So really, you've got, when you say you have $10 billion and you use it as collateral, really you've got like $3.5 billion worth of FTT or $4 billion worth of FTT before the market crashes and before, like the stuff is even unlocked, because that stuff is, a bunch of it was also locked in. They couldn't even get to it, right? So there's way more problems than just that was going on with these things. But that was one of the central issues, is that the stuff they were saying was their collateral, and sort of like, well, just in case it's a rainy day, we can always bail ourselves out with this. Don't you worry about it, lenders. That wasn't actually something they could lend themselves out, because when there's a run on the bank, when everyone freaks out, the prices crash, and suddenly that collateral isn't worth anything, or isn't worth nearly as much. And we saw the price of FTT go from something like $35 to $1 in the span of 36 hours or something. And it remains like at $1.40, and hence Alameda's bankrupt, FTX is bankrupt.
I'm assuming that you would not currently put any more of your money into any of these either exchanges that are centralized or decentralized, things that will give you these high rates of return? Is there a period of time where you're just keeping all of your assets off of crypto assets off of those tables?
Yeah, right now I am. Even though I gave a really nice speech about decentralization versus centralization, my understanding about the way crypto works is that these protocols they all know each other. They all have interesting relationships behind the scenes. We can't necessarily see all of those relationships. So I pulled everything I essentially could out of every spot I could right now, making no yield on essentially anything right now, which is hard for me. I'm a big yield guy. If I were to ever get back into it, which I hope to in a few months, like if everything sort of calms down and it seems like the storm has passed, I think I would only do decentralized things at this point, though. I don't think I could ever trust a centralized exchange anyway again. Maybe if Chase Bank is doing it, I'd feel differently, because they're backed differently. They have the kind of reputation that they sort of have to protect. Maybe I'd feel differently. I can't imagine I'd get a good rate of return with Chase Bank. But, maybe they'd offer 2.5% instead of what they currently offer with some of the crypto opportunities that are out there. And maybe that's a super safe 2.5% instead of, if I'm getting 22%, it can't be as safe as the Chase 2.5, right? It just can't be, even if it's reasonably safe. I would only dive, though, into the decentralized waters personally, because that's where, like on Aave is the biggest lender in the world, decentralized. To borrow money on Aave, you have to lock into a smart contract way more collateral than you are borrowing. And then Aave, the algorithm monitors the prices of all these things every second. And if your collateral starts to drop down in value, it will start selling off your collateral and paying back some of your loans. So that way Aave can't get screwed on it, right? And so Aave protects itself that way. That's not how humans work, though. That's how smart contracts work. So all the centralized stuff is ultimately humans getting on the phone and talking to each other and convincing each other of things. And that's where it gets, as soon as persuasion gets involved, it's problematic.
Okay, I'm the Chicken Little here. And so when I look at the whole market and what's happened to FTX and, what you just experienced with Gemini, and what seems to have been happening, which is just all this massive circular trade between these big exchanges that have like behind the scenes relationships where they're manipulating the market, and there isn't nearly as much liquidity in the market to create a sort of a valid market. So it's a market that these guys can short, or they can buy options and go long, and they could try and make money through these little marginalized trades. But ultimately, they're all tied up very closely with one another. And FTX is another big sort of iceberg to flip over. And what's happening underneath as far as the impacts on the other exchanges, I think is still not fully visible and still not fully clear. And you have Gemini, who, for example, or Binance, who then put out what their assets are and showed their proof of reserves. But they haven't showed all of to my understanding, all of the loans that they owe and all of the debts that they have. So you still don't have a really clear picture of like how actual secure they are financially, and they're the big kahuna, so to speak.
Yeah.
So I would anticipate being a skeptic and being pessimistic about the market here, that there's a lot more. We're in this sort of like holding pattern of fear of like, oh, there could be more to come.
Yeah.
And I believe, given what we've seen so far, that there will be more to come. And in fact, that all these statements that you hear from the exchanges, that we've heard from the exchanges that went bankrupt, up to and leading to them, where everything's fine, and then sorry, we're needing to pause your accounts. I think we have not got to the despair part yet. And Bitcoin is going to dip below $10,000. And we're going to have a few more bankruptcies that come out of this. And I think the sort of retail investors are going to be fleeing for the exit. And there's going to be this crypto winter is going to head into a severe downturn, where we think we were in winter, but it was only that mild December winter where you to get hit with the cold wind in the teeth in January. That is just right in front of us sometime in the next year, 6 months probably.
Yeah. I mean, look, that's completely possible, what you're saying. I'm always the long-term view here. Like I'm looking at everything always on a timeline like out to 2030. Like, sure, I love to be richer sooner all the time. Everyone would, but I'm always thinking of it that way. So when I like try and put everything that's going on currently in context, I see this as like a cleansing fire, like in the forest where like we had to kill a bunch of the dead stuff that's in the way. We had to get rid of all that and clean out the, all the gutters and everything. So that way, like we could be ready for the real deals. Cause it seems to me that FTX, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe FTX would have been fine had they gotten through this. Sometimes it goes that way, but probably based on everything I can tell how they were running their business, if it didn't collapse now, it would have collapsed in the future, most likely. And if it's 2026 and it's being the second biggest exchange in the world, isn't, I'm not sure, a $50 billion proposition, but a $5 trillion proposition by then, or a $500 million proposition, or sorry, $500 billion proposition, that would be much more damaging to crypto, much more damaging to people, much more damaging, period. So I see this as like, ultimately, believe it or not, good for Bitcoin, good for Ethereum, good for the main cryptos that I expect to be around over the long haul, good for things like Polkadot, because we want to clean this stuff out as soon as possible. And that doesn't mean that there isn't going to be a lot of pain in the next year. Your prediction could be right. I don't know that it's going to be by any means. Bitcoin under 10,000, it's possible. Sure, it could happen, but it really could not. It depends on if we get into a big despair thing, if there are much more big bankruptcies, if a lot more dominoes fall, then yeah, it probably will go that way. If it's been more contained and this is the end of it, probably not. Feels like we have hit some level of support. It's unclear. But either way, I don't believe that's going to affect the long-term price of Bitcoin. I could be wrong on that because maybe countries will regulate differently as a result of these things, but I don't think so. And so from my point of view, good. Let's get all the dead wood out as soon as possible. It sort of sucks that it happened this way. It sucks in lots of ways. It sucks for the people who got affected by this. I almost got very affected by it personally. I just missed out on that. I mean, I owned some FTT, so I got affected that way, but whatever. But ultimately, I'm still thinking about 2030. And if we can get the shady players out now, hopefully Binance will either prove to be the real deal or they will also fall by the wayside. And I'd rather have them fall sooner than later when it affects less people. And like, let's get something out there that does work, and if they're not going to be a true solution. Like I'm ready, like let's burn it all down and whatever's still standing, let's work off of that. That sounds great to me. That's how I think it should be.
Okay, so we're going to leave it there on that note of optimism, and we'll see what happens. SBF is having an interview with Andrew Sorkin, I think, tomorrow.
Yeah,
that should be right. a show
in New York. In New York, I can't. Apparently, he's not going to be arrested. Apparently, he's just going to walk in and do this, and it's going to be fine. I don't understand how this is possible. It's going to be wild.
We're living in a bizarro world.
Yeah.